We will question everything. The topic of today's discussion is the referendums in the Ukrainian eastern parts, with a focus on the Donbass and the two provinces. If you haven't noticed it or haven't learned by now, well, you should, because the Western media is full of it, is that there is a referendum going on for the last 5 days in Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson area and Zaporozhye area, which are in the south of Ukraine. And they have been voting to decide whether they should join Russia. And if the people have decided to do that, then Russia will effectively make them part of Russia, and they will become under the jurisdiction of Russia, and the laws and the the laws of Russia and the constitution of Russia and the military protection of Russia, everything like that would kick in. If you have read the Western media in the last couple of days, none of the Western countries would like to, stated clearly that they will not recognize the outcome of the referendums, and that it's basically a sham referendum. But we have become used to that because the Western countries are enormous hypocrites. They would support the referendums when it suits them, and they will disallow referendums when it doesn't suit them. With the most recent example being the lack of referendums from Finland and Sweden to join NATO, which NATO expressly stated that it wasn't necessary. They're not going to consult the population on a major issue of joining a defensive, no, not offensive, offensive group. So that was a very dangerous situation and unnecessary by Sweden and Finland, but we let it there. The whole, I would say, Western reaction to the referendums doesn't seem to me to have any effect on the Russian bear. It's just like they don't care much, and they don't value their opinions, and they basically expect it in any case. So one has to ask, why are these referendums held? And basically it comes to that the Russians, or the rest of the world, which means the eastern and southern part, like Asia and Africa and South America, they still have to look at the legal implications. And Russia is basically holding the referendums in order to satisfy them and maintain the Russian relationship with that part of the world, which excludes the western part. So that they don't care really much what's happening or how the West feels, and there's just no reaction. Well, I would like to state basically, one has to ask yourself, while the West always proclaims it's a bastion of democracy, and then one has to ask yourself, what is democracy? And as far as I understand the definition, it's a government by the people, for the people. And that means a government is supposed to represent the people and manage the people and govern them for the best advantage of the people. And if it doesn't really do that, then the government is not fulfilling its mandate and the function and what it was designed. But unfortunately, democracy is not that easy, and in practice it always goes haywire. Our current politicians in the Western world are not representing the people. They have obtained power, or the power has been given them by the population, and they're abusing it. And you can see that a lot of the Western countries are not acting in the best interest of their people. And we can, the most obvious example would be the energy crisis. And Annalena Baerbock's statement that she expressed her support for Ukraine, and she doesn't care what the populations or the voters think about that. You know, that's a typical example. But I mean, there are multiple like that. As a whole, the energy crisis should never have happened. The industry is being destroyed, and that's definitely not in the best interest of the population. But we have talked about that, so we're going to lose that. We're going to leave it for a moment. Now, if it comes to the referendums and independence, it's a sort of it was a gray area, but I will give a good explanation, or not me, but somebody else will give that explanation, and why it's valid to have referendums and independence or separation from your country. And usually what happens is that, well, the Russians usually refer to the Kosovo independence. Now, you should know by now that Kosovo was a part of Serbia, and that in 1991, just after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they had a referendum where they tried to establish a separate state, and most of the people voted in that referendum to have a separate state. Now, I just want to notice that in 1991, they were still part of a government, or the Soviet Union, and when it broke up, they were still part of Serbia. So there was no reason to assume that the government in Serbia was not representing the people in Kosovo. Then I also would like to say that in 1988, there was supposed to have been a massacre by the Serbians in Kosovo, which turned out later to be a huge lie by NATO. Well, it was a NATO attack, bombing, 70 days or so, 78 days. Where they destroyed a lot of civilian infrastructure and killed a lot of civilian people in Serbia. They even destroyed the Chinese embassy in Serbia, which the Chinese are still very angry about. In any case, and then the NATO sent some peacekeepers into Kosovo, which are nothing more than an occupational force. And that is where they are still today. And if you haven't heard, there were some recent border disputes for the Kosovo government trying to, well, they wanted to ban Serbian number plates for cars, and Serbians that were still living in Kosovo still had to get Kosovoan passports also. In any case, in 2008, the Kosovoan government finally declared themselves independent and became a nation state. And most of the Western states actually recognized Kosovo as an independent state. There are about 4 NATO members that don't recognize Kosovo. And even the UN doesn't recognize the independence of Kosovo. Now, and the Russians always mention that, and Russia also doesn't recognize Kosovo as an independent state. And it usually states that the Western governments has forced the issue and created precedents for independence and secession from a country. And they have banned basically the UN rules. And that's why we have a general idea that Crimean referendum and now the current referendum should also be legal, but of course the double standards for the Western world, they don't want to recognize because it doesn't suit them. But then Mr. Sergei Lavrov, who I will state right here, is one of the few people in the world that I really respect. He is a diplomat of formidable stature. And if I ever had to give him a Nobel Prize, if it was available for diplomats, I would have nominated him every time. It doesn't matter whether he's Russian or not. Forget about that. As a person, if you look at him talking, what he says, how he handles diplomatic issues, I believe that is one of the best examples that any future diplomat should follow. But in any case, so he had a big speech at the UN, which I would like to still try to obtain a transcript of that speech, and then I will address in the video. But after his speech, he went to a press conference, and then he made answered some questions. And actually, one South African reporter, kudos for him, from here, asked him a couple of questions. And then Lavrov actually explained in detail what is the legal framework for these type of referendums and secessions, and why they believe it is a legal process under international law according to UN Charter. Now, I've included a clip of that explanation. It is unfortunately in Russia, but I've listened to the translation from the UN website itself and from RT. There's a woman translator in the UN version, and there's a male translator in the RT Russian TV.com video, and they basically say the same thing, which means it's quite credible. And again, kudos for the translators. It's not an easy task to translate one another person to speak in a different language. So I have also a higher respect for those type of people. So without ado, here's a segment of it. And please listen carefully to what he says, or what is being translated. You have to look carefully on what he says.
I will explain to the principles of the United Nations Charter provide for respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. At the same time, they provide for respect for the right of people for self-determination. And the apparent conflict between these two concepts has been subject to many negotiations quite a long time. Soon after the United Nations was established, a process was started to develop the understanding of all the principles of the Charter.
And in 1970, in the year 1970, by consensus, a declaration of the General Assembly was adopted on the principles of relations amongst states in line with the Charter of the United Nations, which had a separate section, the right of nations to self-determination. There was a separate section on territorial integrity. And so the conclusion that the General Assembly arrived at vis-a-vis the interpretation of the Charter of the United Nations is as follows. All states have an obligation to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples and whose governments represent all peoples residing on their territory. If somebody is to tell me now that after the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, after the prohibition on the Russian language, Russian education, Russian media outlets, after the putschists for many long years continued to bombard the territory whose population refused to recognize the results of the coup. If after all of this, somebody dares to tell me that the clique which is sitting in Kiev, the neo-Nazi regime seated there, pushing Nazi theory and practice in the legislation, that this regime represents the interests of the people in the east of Ukraine, I would probably simply smile, because for any impartial observer, it is absolutely clear that this regime completely fails to represent those people who feel themselves to be the bearers of the Russian language and the Russian culture. Everything is a Russian. Where did a quote? If you wish to, I quoted, if you wish to be Russian, then leave.
Now, if you listen to his this explanation. The first part is that the UN, United Nations Charter makes provision for referendums and also for self-determination. So from a legal point, that already is a legal matter. And then because of the certain misunderstanding on the terms and how it should be interpreted, there were a lot of discussions held by various countries and negotiations. And the General Assembly in 1970 agreed on what it really means. And according to what Sergei Lavrov has said or explained, is that, which I come back to, a democracy. The people elect a government that has to represent the people's interest. Now, if a country like Ukraine, who had a coup, and this new government that came out of the coup doesn't represent the interest of certain sectors of the population, like it did in the eastern part, then that eastern part has the right, under the UN Charter and as agreed by the General UN Assembly in 1970, that those people can secede from their main country and declare independence. Precisely what happens to the Donbass and Crimea. So if Mr. Sergei Lavrov is speaking the truth, then the legal aspects of these referendums should be acknowledged and should be acceptable by the international community and the members of the UN. And like I stated at the beginning, Russia doesn't care what the West says because they have double standards. He's going through these motions because that is the legal way of doing things. And he has to explain his legal the actions that he's taking in the legal framework of the UN to his partners and friends in a multipolar world. And if you look at the news, there are very few countries in the non-Western part that express that they are not recognizing these referendums. Yes, there will always be some countries, but they are lackeys of the Western world and they're basically bullied in those positions. So I can understand that. In any case, what is the implications of this referendum? Well, one has to look basically what has happened in the last couple of months since February. And the Russian SMO was originally to protect the Donbass and retain their borders, conquer those borders. And because of the threats that Ukraine made against Crimea, it was probably necessary to occupy Kherson and Zaporozhye, because there's the water supply, which the Ukrainian government has cut off, and also the power supplies to to Crimea. And in any case, to create a buffer zone for Crimea, which is now not, which is now a double-edged sword. Well, not a double-edged sword, but it's not being settled, but I will explain to you just now. And that is, and also the cities were easily occupied or conquered or, well, at the beginning in February, the Russian army or the Donbass army moved into Kherson and in Zaporozhye and easily occupied the large areas and the cities and so on without a big fight. So that was a bonus. They didn't want to get really involved in entering other cities against popular belief as a fake attack on Kiev. Because doing fighting in densely populated areas and cities is a very costly exercise in terms of manpower. And if it's not really worth it, then why do it? So those two bottom oblasts were easily conquered and occupied. and that was the original part of the SMO. Now, with the counter-offensive that the Ukraine have done below Kharkiv, exposed basically the shortage of manpower, number one, as well, which was sufficient for the initial phase, but now the situation has changed. And the fact that the Donbass commanders were in control of the military operation showed that a change had to come. And I also believe that all the things were planned beforehand. Like I said, they had steps, plan A, B, C. If this happens, then we will do that. If that happens, we will do that. If that happens, we will do that, and so it will escalate. And so when there were some domestic, not problems, but not satisfaction, no. The population started to moan, basically, on social media. And even some of the leaders were starting to complain about the withdrawal of the forces south of Kiev. I think Putin decided that's it. So let's go up to the next step. And that's what they did. And I believe that the major part of this mobilization will be used in order to populate the long front and to ensure that there will be no future lack of personnel or sparsely populated defensive positions along the military front. And I believe that would be the main object of the mobilization. Well, it has already been decided. The two oblast population voted for incorporation into Russia by a huge margin, like 90% and 99% and so forth. While it stated that the percent of the voters that did come out to vote voted. So we don't really know how much people have voted. Then the Donbass and Lugansk were in any case already determined in 2014-15 when they voted to join Russia, and Russia didn't want to do it. So that was sort of a given. And now these four two republics, and well, let's keep it official, 2 republics and 2 Ukrainian Oblasts will now become part of Russia. It will still take some time, but I believe it will be a very speedy process, because they have to do that in order to start to take over the military command and the military structure on the front line, incorporate the Donbass and the Kherson Region militias into the force, and distribute basically they called up reserves. And that is what their plan is. And then one has to look, and now it becomes Russian territory. The leadership, Putin and Medvedev and everybody that's on the Russian side has warned everybody else that this cannot be reversed. They are now part of Russia, and if you attack those areas, you will be attacking Russia. Then Russia has, from a legal point of view, remember always legal, UN Charter, the right to defend itself. Whether the West acknowledges or not, that's a debate that's irrelevant. You know, when 2 parties have a dispute, you go to court and you have a third party to finally make sense of the arguments and then decide who is right or wrong. But in this case, it's not going to happen, because you have the Russian side and then you have the Western side, and the one says so and the one says so, and there's currently no third party that's going to evaluate who's right and wrong. So it doesn't matter how much the West actually moans and groans, it's not going to change the outcome. But what is important here is that the Russians have been consistently warning the West of not supplying the weapons, and that they can become part of the conflict. And they've been warning the US that they are becoming part of the conflict. So that warning has now changed. the West has supplied weapons to Ukraine, which Ukraine basically used to attack the breakaway republics, which were supported by the Russians. Remember, they weren't support action. They were not actually driving the whole military action. So they were in a support. And therefore, there was never a really attack on the Russian territory. And therefore, the Russian warnings were more warnings. It wasn't really a threat. It wasn't a red line. They couldn't use it as a red line because those governments were not party of the Russian territory. But now they are. And that makes a huge difference in terms of the legality of anything. Russia, as soon as these oblasts and republics become part of Russia, it's Russian territory, and now Russia has the legal right to defend itself and use everything means possible to do that. Now this is the total game changer. And it replaces the Scott Ritter game changer effect narrative. So one has to really think on how the West is going to react to this matter. And it's becoming more and more dangerous by the day. Now, what I do expect is, since these oblasts, Kherson and Zaporozhye will become part of Russia, the other oblasts in Ukraine, which are mostly Russians, will also see that, and they would probably like to go on themselves, become part. And if I talk here about, I talk Mykolaiv and Odessa. I'm not sure about Kharkiv. We will see what will happen there. But those bottom two oblasts, I've got a 95% of surety that they will finally become part of Russia as well. In any case, that's my story for today. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, press the like button, and you know the drill. Come on, please. Button, press the button. And until next time, cheers.